Centuries ago, 12 adventurers went on an expedition to find the birthplace of the world, the source of all magic. Unbelievably, they succeeded. When they entered that otherworldly garden, they each received powers beyond imagination. Some were imbued with such strong magic, they were elevated to the position of living gods. Of the two elves in the expedition, one went on to become the celebrated elven king, Aurangzeb. He quickly realized that the power the 12 had unleashed was a blessing as well as a curse. It would destroy their homeland, but the citizens could be saved, given a little more time. Aurangzeb helped buy that time by sacrificing his very life. He entered a suicidal battle with his old friend Jean, who had become the god of destruction. When Aurangzeb fell, his life force burst forth, washing over the elves whose lives he'd saved. They were imbued with his memories, his feelings, and his hatreds. Aurangzeb's memories were passed down from generation to generation. Not with conscious effort, but as an intuitive part of elven nature. Aurangzeb became not only the last elven king, but the spiritual ancestor of his entire race. However, over time, the memories began to fade. All elves trained for the day they could avenge their fallen king by slaying his murderer. But Aurangzeb's thoughts had dulled in their hearts. Only those warriors who trained the hardest in the battle arts, who devoted themselves most completely to elven magic, found that they could recall Aurangzeb's memories with true clarity. The more they learned, the more skilled they became, the more they remembered. On the field of honor, you felt wisps of Aurangzeb's memories swirling and condensing within your mind. You'd never before fought a human. They'd never before been allowed on the field of honor. As your Nuian opponent raised his blade, the image of his face reflected on the gleaming metal. But it wasn't his face. The reflection showed an angry, dark-haired man with a taunting sneer. The vision lasted only an instant, but your heart explained what your mind could not. The man you'd seen was Aurangzeb's murderer, his former friend turned enemy, Jean. Jean had become Kyrios, the god of destruction, but Aurangzeb had hated him long before that. Even before the expedition, Jean was the subject of Aurangzeb's unhappiest memories. Jean's actions after receiving the power of a god had only fueled Aurangzeb's anger. And facing a human in battle had caused you to briefly look out through his eyes. Nausea washed over you when you received word of the Nuian's death. Memories you didn't recognize crowded your mind, briefly drowning out your own thoughts. Your heart rejoiced at the Nuian's death, but it wasn't a genuine feeling. It was nothing more than a reflection of Aurangzeb's desire to slay Kyrios. As you pushed the feeling aside, you were overcome by a new vision. The memory unfolded, and you once again found yourself looking out through Aurangzeb's eyes. The first thing you noticed was Jean's face, but in a new setting, before he'd become Kyrios. He wasn't sneering or wearing armor imbued with dark magic, but was seated in a sunny hall. laughing. Genuine merriment twinkled in his eyes as he gazed at someone just out of view. The vivid contrast between this and what you'd seen of Jean previously was unsettling. As your mind whirled, you almost missed the dire proclamation. You'd been accused of murder. The High Council had ruled the elves since Aranzeb's time back on Auroria. In fact, Aranzeb had several memories of his dealings with them. The Eocad, however, was a more recent invention, implemented since the elves' arrival on Nuia. While the Council addressed elven politics and law, the Eocad were all warriors. Though called priests, it was more of a cultural determination than a religious one. They guided and shaped elven culture and behavior, with the ultimate purpose of preparing the race to slay Kyrios and avenge their murdered king. Enoir had always been a bit of a firebrand among your people. Rumors said he'd been invited into the Eocad only so he could be better controlled. But he had somehow managed to rise through the ranks and now led the group as High Priest. Perhaps more elves doubted their isolationist path than were willing to admit it publicly. Many elves seemed like they would be happy enough just to find a scapegoat for the Nuians' murder. The Council seemed like it would be happiest if that scapegoat was Enoir. Balayan, however, was different. Above all else, he wanted the truth. His noble bearing reminded you of Aranzeb. Magic throbbed in your head as Balayan searched your mind for clues to establish your innocence, as well as your honor. As he dredged through your thoughts, you recalled your vision of Jean laughing. You followed the memory further. The point of view shifted, as if Aranzeb had turned his head. Across the table, you saw what Jean was smiling at. A raven-haired woman in a mage's robes. Earlier, when you saw that woman through Aranzeb's eyes, you felt a pang within your soul. Love. A pure love, deep and abiding, hummed through you, one of Aranzeb's most powerful emotions. A name formed in your thoughts. Kiprosa. That was the raven-haired woman you'd seen, the one wearing mage's robes. She'd been another of the 12 adventurers, as well as human. Aranzeb had loved her, beyond words, beyond measure, beyond logic. He hadn't hated all humans after all. Perhaps the realization made you curious to learn more about humans. Or perhaps you wanted to deepen the weight of coin in your pockets. Whatever the reason, you volunteered to help Balayan investigate the Nuian knight's death. If the other elders had ever shared this memory of Aranzeb's life, they showed no sign of it. They seemed to hate and fear Nuians as much as they hated and feared Kyrios himself. Without waiting for Balayan's investigations, they declared Enoir guilty of the knight's murder. They wanted nothing to do with humans, and if preventing contact meant taking down Enoir, all the better. Had an elf been the victim, the elders would have sought his killer to the ends of the earth. But they wanted to sweep this event under the proverbial rug. You heard they wanted no one to ever speak of it again. Having seen several of Aranzeb's most intimate memories, part of you couldn't help but wonder. What would the beloved Elven King himself have done in such a situation? The knight had a wife, a family, a life. Of course he had, though it seemed like the elders had chosen to ignore it. The knight had probably been surrounded by warmth and love. Unbidden, another of Aranzeb's memories surged into your mind, blocking all other vision. A forest picnic on a steamy summer day. Aranzeb surrounded by a number of friends. In the shade of a tree, Kiprosa and Jean shared a tender embrace. Kiprosa looked up and smiled at Aranzeb, then companionably offered a bottle of ale to share. As he reached for it, a stunning young elf maiden beside him tugged at his sleeve. She shot a chilling glare at Kiprosa and shoved her own drink into Aranzeb's hand. You'd never felt so immersed in a memory. As the vision faded, you could still feel the frost of that icy bottle on your sun-warmed skin. It was a long road to reach the Knight's Widow. Along the way, your eyes were opened. There were so many, elves and Nuians alike, who required aid. Clearly not all was right in Nuia. How could it be, when so many citizens seemed so desperate? Aranzeb had lived in a grand city. He'd seen poverty and strife, but nothing like this. Everywhere you turned, someone new was desperate for help. Many locals were concerned about the recent resurgence of Dahuta cultists in the area. You recalled a painting of a beautiful elf maiden with chilling eyes, the goddess Dahuta. She'd been one of the 12 adventurers and had become a goddess, just like Jean had become a god. But before that, as an ordinary elf, her name hadn't been Dahuta. It had been Aranzebia. She was the godchild of Aranzeb himself. Finally, you recognized the elf maiden from Aranzeb's latest memory. How could you ever forget that frosty stare? The further you traveled, the more Dahuta cultists you encountered. She was the goddess of the sea and the goddess of change. Though what her cultists were hoping to change was unclear. Perhaps they wanted to overturn the cult of Nui that had dominated since the exodus from Auroria. Or perhaps they wanted something more insidious. You'd heard bards sing of Dahuta's vast underwater palace and troves of male slaves. Supposedly, she'd use magic to make their faces all identical. As far as Aranzeb's memories had told you, his godchild had held no particular love for the sea. It seemed entirely by chance that she had inherited her specific powers. Similarly, perhaps Jean had become the god of destruction only by chance. Aranzeb had always suspected Jean's soul possessed a certain darkness. Elves abhorred bribes of the kind you'd had to use with Graeliant. They stunk of dishonor. Honor was of utmost importance. Kyrios had long been called the betrayer for his dishonorable actions as the god of destruction. No elf wished to ever be seen in a similar light. Aranzeb felt Jean had specifically betrayed Kiprosa, but the memories were too dark and jumbled to know more. Hopefully your actions with Graeliant wouldn't cause you to lose all semblance of honor. After all, you'd only just been cleared of murder. Apparently, Graelian's notorious greed was unusual, even for a human. Regardless, stooping to his level wouldn't do your reputation any favors. Helping the rebel Enoia, bending to dishonorable human traditions. You truly had begun to live dangerously. You'd always been aware of the elves' mistrust of humans, the mistrust Enoia wanted to combat. What was interesting was that some humans distrusted elves just as much. Dealing with Graelian had been quite a lesson. Though most humans seemed more than noble, Graelian had no redeeming qualities whatsoever. His refusal to cooperate with the elves, even with all you'd done for him, stunk of betrayal. A memory pricked the edge of your consciousness, and you invited it to the front of your mind. Through Aranzeb's eyes, you saw Kiprosa and Jean shouting at each other, a vicious lover's quarrel. Finally, Kiprosa spun away from him, sobbing. Jean stalked off as she struggled to wipe at her tears. Aranzeb moved to comfort her, but Aranzebia blocked his path and tenderly stroked his cheek. "Don't betray your race," she murmured. The visceral disgust Aranzeb felt at his godchild's touch made you stagger. The coastal Dewstone area was thick with Dahuta's worshippers. Aranzeb's memories told you that before she'd become the goddess of the sea, he had loved his goddaughter, albeit in a fatherly way. It was unlike his unrequited passion for Kiprosa, which made your heart ache. It was an appropriate feeling. Dewstone was a land of sadness, often called the graveyard of giants. As their bodies weakened, giant stone colossi made their way to the coast to die. The humanoid boulders at the sea's edge were actually corpses. The sadness triggered more memories. Aranzeb had loved once before, even married, but she had died. His immense grief was part of the reason he'd willingly sacrificed himself fighting Kyrios. He had not only wished to save people's lives, but save survivors from the heartbreak of love lost. The Dahuta cult had indeed had something to do with the Nuian knight's death. However, it was a mystery why they would want to act against a Nuian elf alliance. Such an alliance would be a significant change in the current power structure. It seemed they should have welcomed it as a sign of the goddess herself. Rumors swirled that the sea goddess had gone insane and lacked the power she'd once possessed. This made her cult's devotion seem even more suspicious. Why worship a failing god when Nui still regularly brought the worthy back from the brink of death? Nui's power was obvious, but Dahuta's power was legendary, stuck in the realm of stories and myth. You'd already killed countless of Dahuta's disciples. Whatever power she'd given them hadn't been nearly enough to save their lives. The cultist's letter was written in the elves' characteristic looping language, which told you nothing except that it could have been written by an elf or an educated Nuian. It did, however, remind you of another letter. It was a moment before you realized You were remembering one of Aranzeb's letters, not yours. A desperate letter, a journey to a shadowy palace, and Aranzebia, now Dahuta, awaiting his arrival. You glimpsed Aranzeb's face in a mirror, and realized it wasn't a mirror, but a doorway. The reflection wasn't Aranzeb, but an elf who looked almost exactly like him. One of dozens of identical servants, all enchanted to wear Aranzeb's face. Aranzebia moved to kiss her godfather, and he recoiled. Aranzeb's words echoed in your mind. No, my heart blooms only for Kiprosa. Skirmishes in White Arden, elves dying on the battlefield, cries of war and terror. By now, it was unsurprising when your experiences called up more of Aranzeb's memories. New images from your mind's depths solidified before you. Through Aranzeb's gaze, you saw other battlefields, each bloodier than the last. Misery, terror, devastation, the wake of the god of destruction. Finally, you saw Aranzeb face Kyrios on the battlefield. I'll let you surrender, the dread god snarled. My fight isn't with you. I am rightful heir, and my only goal is to unite this kingdom under one banner. How can your eyes be both so clear and so blind? Aranzeb whispered. His words echoed within you as Maladis brushed off your warnings about the cult and the seal stone. Hundreds of years ago, the Hereafter Gate had opened in this forest. Thousands of innocents had poured through, fleeing the destruction of their continent. Nui's gift to all people, life in the face of death. Everyone knew this story. It was history. What you now learned was that the gate had remained ever since, protected by the Arden Guard and locked shut by mystical seal stones. Without the seal stones, the gate could be easily pierced by the remnants of Kyrios' forces. His army had rained death on an entire continent and thirsted to do so again. Naturally, they'd been trying to weaken the seal stones for centuries. And now, your own people were aiding them. How could their eyes be both so clear and so blind? You helped repair the seal stone before the gate was totally breached. Only the first waves of the Crimson Army broke through, not the vast legions. Even better news, Kyrios had not been among them. But where was he, if not leading an attack on the gate? You searched Aranzeb's memories for clues. You saw Aranzeb with other members of the expedition, hatching a plan to save their people. They wanted to seal Kyrios inside the garden, locking him away for all eternity. To stop him from realizing what was happening, 3 of his friends would face him in battle, distracting him with their very lives. Aranzeb volunteered. Meanwhile, Nui would use her new powers to transport the people to their new home. Elves prided themselves on their prowess in battle. They'd been perfecting these skills ever since the exodus from Auroria centuries ago. To see how easily they could be defeated by the Crimson Army was shattering. Mustering his dignity, Balayan apologized to the Arden Guard on behalf of the Council and Eocad. He vowed that the elves would repay the debt caused by their foolishness. As he and a human Arden Guard shook hands, you remembered another handshake. Aranzeb, and the other adventurers agreeing to the plan to deal with Kyrios. You could feel that Aurangzeb was filled with regret. Not at the thought of fighting Kyrios, or the prospect of losing his life, or even the knowledge he'd never see Kyprosa again. What he regretted was having to seal off the Garden Otherworld. But why? There was a wealth of information in Aurangzeb's recollections. It would take a lifetime to sift through it all. It was a lifetime's worth of memories. However, you found that by mentally focusing on one topic, you could call up specific information. What you learned was shocking. The gods, heroes, and even citizens of Auroria had stripped the land of its magic, its life force. They had used too much. The only thing sustaining the land was the gate to the garden. That other world was the source of all magic, and its magic was now keeping the dying land alive. If the gate was sealed shut, the continent of Auroria would die, an uninhabitable husk. It wasn't just war that had ravaged the continent. It was the draining of its magic. Aurangzeb had been a mage, one of the most powerful mages to ever tread the earth. Losing Kyprosa, watching the destruction of his race, allowing his sworn enemy to kill him. Yes, these things would wound him. They would make him ache. But compared with the prospect of cutting off the magic, the life force, from an entire continent, they would be as dust in the wind. Aurangzeb had respected nothing more than the art of magic. He had devoted his life to studying it, to teaching others how to use it. To voluntarily cut it off at the source by sealing the door to the garden must have killed him inside. By the time Kyrios struck him down, his heart was long dead. Right now, having been away from Auroria so long, the hearts of many elves were likely dead as well. And they didn't even know it. The alliance negotiations between Enoia and the Weird Winds were a stunning success. For their part, most Nuians seemed quite curious about Enoia and his people. They assumed he was the Elven King. Overall, they seemed as curious to learn of Elven culture as they were eager to share their own. You'd already heard them buzzing with details about Marian Opal. The heart of local Nuian culture, the city had been named after the first Queen Marian. Ever since, the ruling families, Noriette, Weirdwind, Trieste, named their daughters Marian. All hoped it would fate their daughter to be the next local queen, empowering her family. It made for confusing family trees, but mirrored the elves' deep connection to history. The difference was that Nuians recorded the past, while elves memorized it. When you saw Deltakin's betrayal, it all made sense. Deltakin had been in charge of the tournament weapons and could have easily poisoned yours. Later, he had been the one to send you to White Arden, preventing you from talking to Enoia. Even the Sealstone battle could have been part of his plot. If the Crimson Army had been victorious, Enoia could have been blamed. The elves would have exiled him, and Deltakin could have abducted and sacrificed him sooner. When Deltakin shouted that the goddess loved the blood of kings, it finally hit you. Deltakin was the Grand Oblate of the Dahuta cult. You recalled Aurangzeb's memories of Dahuta's palace, her servants, enchanted to share his face. She had been obsessed with him, had even loved him, had tried to seduce him. But he had loved another, and her all-consuming desires had never come to fruition. Except, perhaps, with her slaves. But how satisfying would a slave be, compared with a king? The Dahuta cult had many goals, but their Grand Oblate, Deltakin, may have had only one, Enoir. The one name all other elves knew. The single most powerful and influential elf on Nuia. The closest thing to a king the elves had had in hundreds of years, ever since Aurangzeb's death. You'd imagine Deltakin using magic to carve Aurangzeb's features onto Enoia's face. Dahuta would have been elated at the mere prospect. Deltakin's laughter was manic, but tinged with fear. Your entrance had broken his concentration. Now, he began his dread ritual again, whispering a spell and collecting a sample of Enoia's blood. Deltakin shouted that you should have no other gods but Dahuta, and no other kings but the sea. Enoia used his magic to weaken the wards around Deltakin's orb, allowing you to destroy it. Deltakin snarled a chant, filling the room with the roar of powerful magic. You kept fighting. Enoia channeled some of his power into your body. He was a legendary fighter, but few had ever seen him in battle. The Eocad were considered too elite to participate in the field of honor. Now, it was clear why. His magic was overwhelming, and it was only with his help you were able to bring Deltakin down. As Deltakin's last breath escaped him, his body bloated and went gray. Blue lines traced out his veins, and bile-colored algae slickened his skin. He looked as if he had drowned. It was a sign of his goddess, claiming him as one of her beloved. Dahuta had imbued Deltakin with power and altered his being to suit her needs. What else could be expected of the goddess of change? She had changed his true nature as the sea changes in a storm. You couldn't discern his age, or even if he was truly an elf. He was nothing now, a soggy husk that his goddess had no further use for. What kind of rewards must he have been promised to risk so much of himself? And all for naught. The magic unleashed during your battle was powerful enough to attract the rest of the Eocad. When they noticed Deltakin missing from their ranks, you pointed at the seeping corpse nearby. Much explaining followed. Finally, the time came for Enoia to meet the Nuian king. However, Lord Weirdwind interrupted the proceedings with a serious concern. The king could only enter an alliance with an equal, but the elves had no king. To validate the alliance, Lord Weirdwind needed the Eocad to explain their authority structure. Balion explained Enoia was leader of the Eocad, which made him High Priest of Elven society. Traditionally in the past, the Elven King had acted as both king and high priest. Therefore, if the elves must have a king, it would be the high priest, Enoia, by default. You noticed Enoia's eyes widen briefly in surprise. He quickly quashed the emotion in favor of a more kingly one. Balion's statement was more than enough for the Nuians, and the alliance was formalized. When Auroria's magic had been drained, the southern continents had been affected too. Not enough for their energy to be completely depleted, but rather significantly drained. The remaining magic condensed into small stones, like the drops left when draining a tub of water. People would later call these powerful stones Archeum. When they began to use the Archeum they found on the southern continents, they released tiny bits of magic back into the world. As centuries passed, that magic had replenished Auroria's life force. A recent expedition had proven that the land was inhabitable once again. The elves decided to work with the Nuians to defeat Kyrios and reclaim their homeland. Enoir's energy transformed the forest, engulfing all elves in a sense of shared excitement. No one called him king. Elves hadn't had a king, much less a kingdom, in centuries. No one was used to such a title existing again. Despite the preparations, hundreds of elves left the forest and traveled the continent. For the first time, none were termed traitors. However, the Crimson Army had begun launching widespread raids all over Nuia. Some of them had survived the battle in White Arden and dug in. Now they worked as hard to prevent the elves from reaching Auroria as the elves worked to get there. But it was no matter. The elves finally had a new leader and a new direction.